I'm sure there must be some of your relatives.
I don't go to parties. I have a problem driving at night.
Right.
Right, because not central, right?
Called Islamic Foundation. The name of the center is Islamic Foundation. Mahdi, which is
I will tell you what my opinion is, not about the difference, but I would not. I have to be
and you did also do one.
Yes. Yes.
He started and his island was Strasser.
Yes.
And recently, then there's one other. Sure. Right. So basically, you had on kind of region based.
Yes, yes, yes. I have recently used my drill because I have made an acquaintance.
Good evening, everyone. Can I kindly have you all turn your cell phones off? We'll begin shortly. Thank you. Thank you. Forgive me, I have a little bit of a cold, so I'll try to speak slowly so everyone can understand me. Tonight we have with us a distinguished guest for our AIC lecture series. We're very happy to have with us Dr. Kim Searcy, who is the Associate Professor of African and Islamic History at Loyola University. Dr. Searcy's research interests include Islamic revivalism in 19th-century Africa, slavery in Muslim societies, the role of Islamic mysticism in African Islamic polities, and Islam and the African diaspora. He is the author of the book State Formation in the Sudan from 1885 to 1898, Symbols, Ritual, and Ceremony during the Mahdi. He is an expert in this field, and we are privileged tonight to hear him speak on the spread of Islam in sub-Saharan Africa, the influence of Sufism in the spread of Islam in the region. Thank you, Dr. Searcy.
Hello, good evening. Can anyone hear me? This is working, yes? It's not working? It was working when she was doing it. Hello? Is that working now? This is working. Okay. Okay, thank you. I can move this, right? Oh, sorry. Okay, so technology. All right, so good evening. Good to see everyone. Thank you for coming. All right, so I'm gonna talk about the spread of Islam in Africa, south of the Sahara Desert. So since my field is Sudan, I'm gonna spend a great deal of time talking about Sudan, but then I'm not going to be remiss and leaving out other parts of Africa, specifically the West and Central Africa as well. All right, so as far as Islam is concerned and spread of Islam in Africa, we have it spreading in two stages actually. So the first stage, if you look at this map, look at North Africa. So the North African countries north of the Sahara Desert. So the first stage is characterized by the conquest of the early Muslim Arabs. All the Mediterranean littoral from Egypt all the way to Morocco. Then there followed a period of pacification, which quickly succeeded by a breakup of the short-lived political unity into Muslim states, many Muslim states. So Islam slowly won over the Amazigh peoples, so the Berber peoples. And this time period for this stage is usually given from 642 of the Common Era to 1050 of the Common Era. So that's the first stage. The second stage is characterized by the spread of Islam into the Sudan belt from around the 8th century till ostensibly the present. All right, so where's the Sudan belt? So the Sudan belt is this region right here. All right, so it starts in the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Red Sea, actually. So it's this region here, it's like the forested belt region here. This is called the Sudanic belt. Okay, so Arab chroniclers writing before 1500, the Common Era, designated the broad stretch of territory of sub-Saharan Africa from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea as Balad Sudan, which means the land of the blacks. So there was the Western Sudan. So this is the Western Sudan here. Not to be confused with the modern Republic of Sudan, right? So this is the Western Sudan, Central Sudan, this region here, Nilotic Sudan or Eastern Sudan. So Central Sudan includes the basin of Lake Chad and parts of Eastern Sudan as well. So Eastern Sudan includes the modern Republic of Sudan. So I apologize for the map. It's an old map, so everyone knows that the Sudan has been divided into South Sudan and North Sudan. So So this broad geographical designation was adopted by pre-colonial European travelers to the African continent and continues to be used to describe the Great Belt of territory. So from all the way from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Red Sea is known as the Sudanic Belt. And so, as this talk progresses, I'm going to refer to this region as a geographical Sudan, and I'm going to distinguish it from the Nilotic Sudan. So this is the Nilotic Sudan here. It's the Nile, right? Distinguish that from the geographical Sudanic belt. So it is this region known as Sub-Saharan Africa, and that's the focus of this talk. So Sub-Saharan Africa is south of the Sahara Desert. However, Sub-Saharan Africa is not a monolithic region, culturally, linguistically, ethnically, and it's not monolithic in the way Islam spread into the region either. So for the purpose of this talk, I've decided to divide our treatment of Sub-Saharan Africa, the spread of Islam in Sub-Saharan Africa, into how it spread into Eastern Africa, specifically the Sudan, and then the penetration of Islam into the Western Sudanic belt, or Western and Central Sudanic belt as well. So I'm going to first begin with the Sudan, how Islam penetrated into the Sudan, and then Nilotic Sudan, or Eastern Sudan. So prior to the Egyptian occupation in the 19th century of the Common Era, the Nilotic Sudan was divided along linguistic, religious, and cultural boundaries from the first cataract of the Nile. So this map is, I don't know if you can see Aswan right here. You see Aswan? Right here. That's the first cataract. Okay. So from the first cataract of the Nile south of Aswan to the sixth cataract, north of the confluence of the blue and white Niles. You see where it says Khartoum on there? Okay, so this is the confluence of the two Niles. This is the sixth cataract. This is the first cataract here. This region was known as Nubia. South of Nubia was the Funj Sultanate. It's on the White Nile. Okay, to the west of the Funj Sultanate lay the Sultanate of Darfur, which has been in the news recently, right? All right, so throughout the years, these regions have been influenced greatly due to their geographical location. So they're influenced by whom and by what cultures? So they're influenced by the cultures that are surrounding them. So they're influenced by the Arabian Peninsula, the cultures of the Arabian Peninsula, and then they're also influenced by the cultures of Egypt as well. However, the most important cultural influence to come from these two areas, from the Arabian Peninsula and from Egypt, and establish itself in the Sudan, is, of course, Islam. So the niche that Islam carved out for itself in the Nilotic Sudan involved a gradual process that began with the Arabs' conquest of Egypt in 641 of the Common Era. So just in 10 years of the Prophet's death, the Prophet died in 632 of the Common Era. So Egypt was under control, essentially by the Muslim Arabs at this time period. So Alexandria, the last stronghold of the Byzantine Empire, to Egypt fell in the latter half of 641. The Muslim general Amr ibn As began sending military expeditions into Nubia. So at this time period, Nubia, which is the northern Sudan, consisted of two Christian kingdoms. So two Christian kingdoms are Nubia and Alwa. So the kingdom of Nubia extended from the first cataract all the way to the fourth cataract. So the first cataract was Aswan, right? And so you see where the bend of the Nile is here. So ostensibly it's the fourth cataract. So this is where the Christian Nubian kingdoms are located. So the kingdom of Nubia extended from the first cataract to the fourth cataract, and then its capital is known as Dungala Ajuz, which means Old Dungala, and it's located on the upper Nile between the third and fourth cataracts. Alwa's borders ran from the fourth cataract to the upper reaches of the island of Sennar, and its capital, Soba, is located on the right bank of the Blue Nile, about 15 miles from where Khartoum is now. So here's Khartoum. All right, so Soba is right here, around this region here. So how did Christianity enter that region? So missionaries from Egypt introduced Christianity to the Sudan in the 6th century CE. Many churches were built, and there is no evidence of any forced conversions. However, Christianity remained primarily the religion of the kings and the nobility. The people accepted Christianity nominally, but still retained their animism. This is according to J.S. Trimingham. So, however, in the years immediately preceding Islam's arrival, Christianity was a very important cultural influence on Nubia. The language of the region, Nubian, through the influence of Christianity, became a written language. Hence, the nominal acceptance of Christianity by the masses notwithstanding, Christianity had come to shape the national consciousness of the Nubian kingdoms, the 7th century of the Common Era. So, around 642 of the Common Era, when the Arab Muslims began sending raiding parties into Nubia, they found a people loosely united by a common religious culture. It's perhaps due to this unified religious consciousness that these military incursions all ended with the Muslims being defeated by the Nubians. In the face of a foreign foe, the Nubians galvanized their forces to rout this enemy. Heartened by their success, the Nubians themselves began raiding across the border into Upper Egypt. So from Nubia, raiding across the border into this region as well. So there are...
This is easier.
Oh, sorry, I didn't recognize. I didn't see this. All right, so you have raids, counter raids. Nubians are entering into Upper Egypt. The Egyptians, well, the Muslim Arabs are entering into Nubia as well. So you have a force of Muslim Arabs that penetrate as far as the Fourth Cataract into Dongola, lay siege to the town, destroy the church in the city center. And so the Nubian king, seeing his capital city in ruins, sued for peace. The king, the Nubian king, and the Egyptian governor agreed to peace. There's a peace agreement, and that peace agreement is called the Baqt agreement. So it comes from Latin, pactus, it's not Arabic. And so this peace agreement was involved, it's kind of treaty in which every year the Nubians had to send 360 slaves to Egypt, to the Muslims. They also had to maintain the mosque the Muslims had established in Dongola. In addition, the Egyptian governor promised the Nubian king that he would provide him with grain whenever the latter's reserves began to dwindle. So on the basis of these reports, so most of our information concerning this time period comes to us from al-Maghrizi. So, according to Arab historian al-Maghrizi, in the first year of the treaty, the Nubians delivered 40 additional slaves to the Muslims, who in turn gave the Nubians gifts of tools, alcohol, seeds of barley, wheat, and horses. So, I'm telling you this because the Baqt agreement, this peace agreement between the Muslim Arabs and then the Christian Nubians, essentially laid the foundation for trade between Nubia and Egypt. This treaty lasted for 600 years. And there were times when payment was not given, so there were many times when the Nubians didn't send slaves to Egypt. For the most part, slaves from the Upper Nile Valley region were annually transported to Egypt in exchange for wheat and then for barley as well. So, in addition to laying the foundation for trade, the treaty also paved the way for Islam to enter into the Sudan. So Islam, in its initial stages in the Arabian Peninsula, was a very dynamic force that spread very rapidly. As I alluded to earlier, 10 years after the Prophet's death, Arab Muslims were in control of the entire Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, and were established in a foothold into North Africa as well. However, in the Sudan, you can characterize Islam's spread very slow compared to how it spread in North Africa. So the Baqt agreement, this peace treaty between the Muslim Arabs and then the Christian Nubians, was a prelude for Muslim missionary activity in the Sudan. For it allowed traders to have contact with the Nubians, and then these traders undoubtedly engaged in proselytizing endeavors. Furthermore, as I alluded to earlier, a mosque was built in Dongola, so it's in upper Egypt, this region here. This is Dongola here, northern part of Sudan. So a mosque was built there. These factors alone, however, do not paint a complete portrait of how Islam entered into Sudan and became a politically, religiously, cultural dominant part of that region. So what else explains this? Okay, so the Nubians at this time period managed to preserve their religious and cultural integrity for almost 700 years after that initial Arab thrust. Their independent nature allowed them to maintain their political independence and their language in the face of the ever-increasing cultural and religious hegemony of the Arabs. The rise of Islam and the Arabization of some of the Nubian groups in the Nilotic Sudan is primarily attributable to internal causes, specifically the weakness of the Christian church in Nubia. So, the Christian church, the Christian kingdoms of Nubia, they collapsed due to the weakness of Christianity, coupled with the infiltration of Arabs settling in the kingdoms who gradually intermarried with the Nubians. A new Arabized Nubian elite arose from unions between Arab men and Nubian noblewomen. Male offspring from these marriages became noblemen due to the matrilineal system. So this new elite began to increasingly identify itself with both Islam and then Arab culture. Christianity began to slowly disappear through the absorption of the Nubians into the Arab tribal system and then the cultural ascendancy of Islam. Dongola, which is a Christian region, right? So northern part of Sudan. It collapsed around 1320 CE. And then Alwa, which is another Nubian kingdom, collapsed shortly thereafter. So some scholars are there's a discrepancy exactly when Alwa collapsed. Was it shortly after Dongola collapsed, or was it sometime in the 16th century? It's not exactly clear. So how did the Nubian kingdoms collapse? Was it due to Arab wars of conquest? No, it's not due to Arab wars of conquest, but rather through cultural infiltration, which opened the door for Arab and Islamic hegemony in the region. The predominant feature of religious culture of the northern Sudan has been marked by a tradition of Islamic mysticism, personalizing this link between the holy man and his followers and institutionalized in Sufi doctrine. The historical consciousness of the northern Sudanese is colored by the existence of the Muslim holy man or sheikh, also known as faqih in Sudanese colloquial Arabic, and fusha. Okay, sorry. Can you hear me? Okay. All right, I'll slow down. All right. So, I'll back up. Where did I lose you all? Okay, so I'll start from the top. All right, so. Okay. All right, so. Okay, the Sufis. The Sufis? Okay, good. Okay, good. All right, so I'll speak slowly, sorry. All right, so nonetheless, the predominant feature of Islam in the Sudan, the religious culture of the northern Sudan, has been this kind of tradition, this tradition of mysticism, personalizing this link between the holy man and then his followers, institutionalized in Sufi doctrine. So everyone's familiar with Sufism, right? It's Islamic mysticism. So according to Ali Qarar, Islamic mysticism in its Sufi brotherhood's manifestation is the most dynamic form of Islam in the Sudan. The historical consciousness of the northern Sudanese is colored by the existence of the Muslim holy man, or sheikh. So in Sudan, the sheikh is known as faqih. And then that's in colloquial Arabic. In Fusha, classical Arabic, it's known as faqih. And so in classical Arabic, a faqih denotes an individual who's schooled in Islamic jurisprudence, denotes a jurisconsult. However, not in Sudan, not in the Sudanese context. So a faqih or a faqih in colloquial Arabic is a term that's rendered, it comes to denote a holy man, individual who has some sort of special relationship with God, with the divine. So the plural of faqih is fuqaha. It's not used in colloquial Arabic. Instead, the plural of Fakir is fukara. That's colloquial. That's the dialect. So this is used. So essentially, it's a holy man, and it was these holy men, these shuyukh. It's all right. All right. So the initials. So it's these shuyukh, these holy men, they were responsible for the initial spread of Islamic teaching in the Sudan. So this is Islamic teaching in the Sudan received its impetus from these holy men, and many of these holy men, most of these holy men, were adherents to Sufi orders. So early in Islamization in the Sudan, so many of these individuals came from the Hijaz region. So here's the Hijaz. Here's this region that borders the Red Sea, Mecca and Medina, right, the part of the Hijaz. And then you have individuals from Egypt as well. So many of these holy men came from the Hijaz. They came from Egypt. They came from Yemen. And then later on, at a later date, they came from Morocco. However, as time began to progress, when indigenous Sudanese began to study with these individuals, some of the Sudanese began to study in Al-Azhar University in Cairo. And then they went to the Hijaz and studied in Mecca as well. And so it was the indigenous, the local holy men, the indigenous Sudanese local holy men that were responsible essentially for the spread of Islam, this continuing process of Islamization in the Sudan after the initial contact that the Sudanese had with these foreign holy men as well. So, according to Ali Qarrar, who wrote a book on Islam or Sufism in the Sudan, he said most of these holy men came to the Sudan, arrived in the Sudan after the rise of the Funj kingdom. So the Funj is over here. So after the rise of this Funj sultanate right here, and around the early part of the 16th century of the Common Era. So you have the introduction of such Sufi orders as the Qadriya Sufi order and then the Shadliya Sufi order, these Sufi brotherhoods in the Sudan. So that's a result of the influence from the Hijaz region. So those orders initially were not centralized organizations. Rather, all religious authority found its locus in the person of the sheikh. So, as a consequence, there's this kind of strong link between the disciple and then the student. The disciple and the sheikh. And so, people like J.S. Trimmingham, some people don't really like his scholarship, but then he has some important things to say. As a consequence, saint worship or veneration of saints' tombs became very important. According to people like Ali Qarrar as well, he's Sudanese, he says that saint worship or saint veneration became the most important religious influence in the Sudan, and many of these Sudanese saints were regarded by the masses as having a higher status than many major figures in the religious history of Islam. So the lives of many of these saints, these Sudanese holy men, so I'm using those two terms interchangeably, so holy men and then saints. So the lives of these individuals have been chronicled in the biographical dictionary as Kitab al-Tabaqat. So there's a book called the Book of Classes by an individual by the name of Nur Depallah. So he died in around 809 of the Common Era. So this is an important book, and it's well known in the Sudan, actually. So according to this biographical dictionary, the first Muslim reformer in the Funj kingdom, so we're still talking about the Sudan, was an Egyptian by the name of Mahmud al-Araki, and he settled on the White Nile. And so he began proselytizing. These people, what they did is establish schools, they established these khalwas, these places where people would learn the Quran, people would send their children to learn the Quran as well. So this is, again, continuing the process of Islamization in this region. So you have other holy men from Egypt and Arabia. They follow on the heels of these individuals. Enter the Sudan. So they enter into the Sudan with the invitation of these kings, the sultans of the Funj, and in the Ford as well. So the 4 kings and then the 5 kings as well ask these individuals, because it's a way for them to shore up their religious authority. So, for example, if you're a king and then you want to maintain that you are ruling in an Islamic fashion, then in order to shore up your authority, your personal authority, your religious authority, you invite these individuals to come, teach the populace about Islam, make these kind of outward signs of piety. So this is what occurred, essentially. So the majority of these initial holy men, as I mentioned, as I alluded to earlier, came from the Hijaz and then Egypt, and they had a great deal of influence. They had the greatest influence on religious culture in the Sudan during this time period. So Islamization is a process, actually. So this is in 17th and 18th century of the Common Era. So part of this process also involves the Sudanese people also embarking upon the pilgrimage, exchange ideas when you meet other Muslims in Mecca, travel to Medina as well. And so many of these people embarked upon the pilgrimage, studied in Mecca, returned, and then began imparting the knowledge to people in their villages, their various villages that they came from. So those indigenous Sudanese holy men were not as highly educated as their foreign counterparts. But then they were really as responsible for this kind of internal missionary activity. And so this internal missionary activity resulted in a revival of Islam in Nubian and Sennar. So here's Sennar, right here. This region here. So it was the indigenous Sufis, the indigenous holy men, that were responsible for this revival. Then you have migrations of a Nubian group called the Mahas. And so they settled on the Blue Nile. And so what they did, this is during the Funge period, 17th, 18th century of the Common Era. And so these people, the Mahas, they also encouraged the spread of Islam because they maintained that they were descendants of the Ansar, the first Muslim community in Medina. And they adopted Arabic language despite the fact that they are Nubians, right? They speak a Nubian language, Mahasi. They adopted Arabic language as their first language, became conversant in jurisprudence and mysticism as well, and established themselves as miracle-working Faqih families that has influenced the life of the indigenous peoples in the Funge Confederation over there close to the confluence of the 2 Niles there. Okay. So the holy men were also responsible for the Islamization of the Sudan's other major Islamic polities. So we're going to move from the east to the west, actually. Eastern part of Sudan, all the way to Darfur here in the west. Sultanate Fur. So the holy men of Darfur were either immigrants or descendants of immigrants to the region. Sean O'Fay's written a great deal about Darfur, so he surmises that the earliest waves of these immigrants entered the region from the west in the late 16th century of the Common Era. And that was not until the 18th century that missionaries began entering the region from the Nile Valley region. So unlike how Islam penetrated into this part of Sudan, it came from Egypt or from the Arabian Peninsula, Islam or Sufi influences into Darfur came from this region here, from the west, actually. So again, those indigenous holy men, the rural holy men of Darfur, were not as well educated in Islamic sciences as their Nile Valley counterparts, and as a result, their charisma and miracles were unfettered in expression. So in contrast, the Fuqara attached to the courts were better educated and were able to build settlements throughout the state due to their relationship with the Sultan. So this is the Sultan of Darfur. Sadiq al-Mahdi is the great-grandson of the Mahdi of the Sudan. So he's still alive. He's like a former prime minister of the Sudan. So I spoke to him, and then he noted that the holy men were responsible for establishing a religious foundation that allowed Islam to spread in a relatively rapid manner throughout the northern Sudan. These holy men were responsible because They built mosques around which villages and cities sprang up along the banks of the Nile as people flocked to study under the various sheikhs. As a consequence, it was the Sufi sheikhs that informed the Islamic consciousness of the northern Sudanese more than any other factor. They built mosques, established schools for the instruction of the Quran, educated the public on the complexities of Islam. In addition to their knowledge of Islam, the holy men possessed specific personal qualities that set them apart from the ordinary individual. The characteristics of generosity, karam, asceticism, zuhud, and then piety, wara, are held in high esteem in relationship to these holy men. For example, Ismail ibn Jabir learned Islamic jurisprudence from his brother Abdul Rahman and also became known as one of the most righteous and ascetic scholars after he assumed his brother's position as sheikh of a Quran school in the Sudan, in western Sudan, in Darfur. So the manner in which these holy men lived their lives was reported to have been in strict accordance to the rules of Islam. These men paid particular attention to the underprivileged and marginalized members of society. As a consequence, their religious authority was enhanced. It becomes increasingly apparent from these examples that these holy men wielded a great deal of power over much of the Muslim Sudanese. These holy men claimed to be the repositories of holy knowledge, and it was their task to transmit this knowledge to the general populace in a language that they could comprehend. The possession of this esoteric knowledge was considered to be a form of God's favor, karamat, bestowed upon these men. Many of these holy men also claimed to be in communion with the Prophet Muhammad and Al-Khidr and other eminent saints. Furthermore, many claim to have the ability to perform miracles. Miracles performed by Sufis are known as karamat because they are favors not unlike the possession of esoteric knowledge that God has bestowed upon an individual Sufi. The holy man's ability to perform miracles is contingent upon the strength of his barakah. So barakah has been translated as blessing or charisma. So karamat within the Sudanese context can be grouped under 5 headings. So number 1, you have healing. Number 2, you have divination. 3, metamorphosis. 4, power over the elements. And then 5, restoring the dead to life. So there are 2 main families, 2 main holy families in the Sudan. There's the Mahdi family, and then there's the Mirghani family. So the Mirghani family are the founders of the Khatmiya Sufi order in the Sudan. And so all the members of this family are alleged to have power to perform miracles. So for example, Muhammad Uthman al-Mirghani II, the grandson of the founder of the order, said to have restored the eyesight of a woman who was supporting many orphan children. The ability to perform miracles coupled with the genealogical claims of this family and then other holy families, because all these people claim to be descendants of the Prophet, direct descendants of the Prophet, Ashraf. So all of this acted in synergy to bolster the charismatic authority of these sheikhs in the eyes of many of these Muslim Sudanese. Ali Qaraqi mentioned his name because he wrote this seminal book on Islam or Sufism in the Sudan. He contends that a major factor that contributed to the success of the founder of the Khatmiya Sufi order was a widespread belief that this man's claims that he was a direct descendant of the Prophet Muhammad were authentic, unlike the general pretension to such descent. So these holy men, these individuals, these Sudanese holy men, possessed a great deal of power in the Sudan. But they did not seek out political power, preferring to exercise influence from the solitude of the Quran schools, Sufi lodges. So they accepted the established authority, and many of their schools were subsidized by the government because it gave the government a semblance of kind of religious authority. If you're going to subsidize these schools, then of course you must have some sort of relationship, a good relationship with Islam and these holy families. And so at the beginning of this talk, I referenced West Africa. So West Africa is very important for us, those of us who live in the United States, because as individuals residing in the United States, we should be acutely aware of this region. Why? And we should be acutely aware of this region because of its relationship with Islam, and then all those individuals who trace their lineage back to Africa, trace their lineage back to West and Central Africa. So the majority of people of African descent here in the United States, the continent of the United States, and not only just the continent of the United States, but all the Americas, can trace their lineage all to West and Central Africa. And so furthermore, the first Muslims to enter into the Americas, specifically the continental United States, came en masse via the transatlantic slave trade. So Islam has a long history, a long, rich history in West Africa. But then it entered into West Africa in a different manner than it entered into the eastern Sudan. So how did it enter into it? It was from North Africa. It was from North Africa that Islam penetrated into West Africa and Central Africa. So it was the commercial activities of Muslim merchants, predominantly Berbers, not Arabs, that allowed Islam to enter into this region. So you have like a flourishing trans-Saharan trade. So you have salt from the Sahara Desert traveling north, southwards in exchange for gold from these regions as well. So what you have is this flourishing trans-Saharan trade, not Arab military wars, not Arab wars of conquest, but trade is what introduced the faith south of the Sahara Desert, beginning around the 8th century of the Common Era. So beyond the political boundaries of Islam, relations between Muslim merchants and host societies follow the rules established by local rulers. African kings tried to confine Muslim traders to specific locales. This is I'm talking about the initial stages. So they try to confine these merchants, these foreign merchants, to what these scholars mention or denote as stranger quarters. They didn't want them in the city centers with the people. So the Muslim traders were confined to these specific locales in order to tap the revenues associated with long-distance commerce. In this context, only a few Africans came into contact with foreign Muslims. The first initial converts were local merchants. Then, after them, members of the court. So the initial converts, local merchants, because why? They shared a commercial ethos with the foreign Muslims. And the political elites, they adopted the religion of their trading partners in order to solidify ties, these trading ties with them. Also allowed them some sort of attachment to a global religion as well. So despite the obvious influence of trade and traders and the Islamization of West Africa, the historical consciousness of many West African Muslims, like their Eastern co-religionists, is colored by the existence of Muslim holy men as well. The Muslim holy man, or sheikh, early in the Islamization of West and Central Africa, many of these men, again, most of these people, the holy men came from Morocco. However, over time, black Africans who had studied at Azhar University, some of these other schools in North Africa, they were the individuals that began to essentially dominate the process of Islamization. And they're the ones, because they're conversant in the language of the local people. They know the traditions. They know the culture. So you have, for example, such Sufi orders as the Qadariya order, the Tijaniya Sufi order. The Qadariya order made its first appearance, was introduced at Timbuktu from a North African cleric. So these Sufi orders initially were not centralized organizations. Again, they all found their religious authority in the persona of the sheikh. So the holy man is very important as far as this process of Islamization is concerned within the context of African Islam. Again, just like we saw in the case of the Sudan, these holy men, they built mosques, they built schools, and so it was these sheikhs that informed the religious consciousness, the Islamic consciousness of many of these West Africans, more than any other factor. So trade is the initial vector, but then it was due to the activities of these holy men that essentially allowed Islam to become internalized in the hearts and minds of the Sudanese. When I'm talking about Sudanese now, I'm talking about these people that inhabit this entire Sudanic belt. So trade initially, and then the proselytizing activities of Muslim holy men. So the process of Islamization continues to occur, even in the contemporary period. I remember the last time I was in the Sudan, I met an individual. He's from the southern part of Sudan, actually. So this region here, from Wow. He's from Wow. And then, what was really intriguing about this individual is that he taught Arabic. He taught the Quran. And then, the majority of people in his ethnic group are not Muslims. They're either adherents of like local religions or Christians as well. And I asked him, how did he become a Muslim? He said that he became a Muslim when he traveled to Khartoum and then attended a school there as well, because no one in his family was a Muslim. Attended school, learned Arabic very well, spoke Arabic very well as a native speaker, and then he even at that point, even considered himself an Arab at that point. So the process of Islamization in Africa is a very slow, gradual process that continues to the present day. All right, so thank you. I think I over my time.
Anybody have any questions?
Please.
Yeah, I have a question about pretty early talk. You spoke of the intermarriage of the women from the sort of noble families in the Sudan
Right.
with Arab Muslims who were coming in, and sort of the idea of, as I understood it, their children would be both recognized in Sudan as noble, but also they would be affiliated with an Arab tribal lineage.
Right, because
Okay.
for example, in Nubian,
Yeah.
it's matrilineal descent. So these individuals, if they married noble women from Nubia, then the children will be recognized as nobility. And then since Islam and Arab culture is patrilineal descent, and so these individuals, their children, their offspring would be Arabs, and then if they claim descent from the Prophet, they would be considered Ashraf as well. So,
Okay. So I have two questions
okay.
related to that point.
Okay.
One is in earlier Islamic history, like much earlier, let's say Umayyad period, there was the institution of the Mawali, that you actually had to be a client of an Arab tribe as part of the process of becoming Muslim. I'm assuming that this is not like that. You know, it's kind of like a looser connection to an Arab tribe, question one. The second question is, in the case of these Arab traders who went to Southeast Asia, or people from Yemen especially, right, Hadramaut, they would have a family in Malaysia and Indonesia, and then they would have a family back home in Yemen, you know, and they would kind of go back and forth. Was it like that in the Sudan? In other words, did these Hijazis and Yemenis have families back home, Arab families, and then families in the Sudan? Or did they basically come to Sudan and settle there and have one family?
Okay.
If you know, I don't know, maybe it's a hard question.
Okay, so I can only talk about, as far as that last question is concerned, I can talk about, for example, the family of the Murghani family, because they're originally from Iraq. And so this is like one of the holy families in the Sudan. So what occurs is that the individual, so Muhammad al-Murghani first, traveled from Iraq, didn't have a family there, intermarried, or married some local women, and then they started an entire new lineage there. So that's the only thing I have to say. So for example, al-Maghribi, these other individuals of Baqt, they don't really reference anything about, well, these individuals have families outside of the Sudan as well. So, and then your first question was, it's much looser, actually. So there are clients. There are clients in the Sudan. So there are ethnic groups that have clients. But then, as far as the Nubian is concerned, at this time period, those are not clients. The local noble women married these Arab traders and these people that maintain that they are descendants of the Prophet. There's a prestige, there's some aura, prestige at this time period with Arab culture and then Islam as well. Because this is around the 15th, 16th century of the Common Era. And so it would not be considered untoward for these noble women to marry these Arab men. They're not clients. So the children would be considered, part of a noble class, actually. That's why we have, for example, in the Sudan, we have all these tribes that are from this region here. in the riverine region here that maintain that their lineage, their descent, is from directly descended from Muhammad, because the Arabs came there, intermarried with the local women, but they're not clients. So it's much looser because the women are Nubian culture, it's matrilineal, and then Arab culture, Islamic culture is patrilineal. So I guess they get the both worlds. There's a hand over here. Sorry. Yes, please.
I'm not sure that, thank you very much, basically enlightening us that it is a fact that these two basic factors, that the tasawwuf and the trade, or mysticism and the trade, are the basic factors in terms of spread of Islam in Africa, most of Africa. My question basically is that you mentioned that the tasawwuf or these really came from Hijaz. I was wondering, because there has been no tasawwuf in Hijaz, or if there was, it was very much kind of, you could say, underpressed or underground. And the second thing we see is that, for example, you remember that I think in the early Abbasid period, the revolt of the Zanj,
Yes.
right? So all these people basically were from this area, or must have been related to this area, and particularly the slave trade in Baqt and all that must have been going on. And so my question is basically, when you are saying that they came from Hijaz, maybe that you meant from Iraq. Are you considering Iraq
No,
as Hijaz?
consider the Hijaz. There's Sufism in Hijaz. You're perhaps thinking about it in the contemporary period. You're thinking perhaps after the Wahhabi, after Wahhab. I mean, this is what occurred like in the latter part of the 1700s, early part of the 1800s, because that revolt was due because they were trying to eliminate all those accretions that had crept into what they believed Islam, corrupted Islam. So one of their criticisms was that, yes, that Islamic mysticism, tasawwuf, was un-Islamic. So yes, there indeed was Islamic mysticism, the Sufi brotherhood. There was Sufism in the Hijaz. So I said Hijaz, Egypt, and then Morocco. So yes, there was indeed mysticism.
Because the whole point is basically in Hijaz, we don't have the centers, in other words, or even learning centers. Makkah and Medina, they were important basically for the pilgrimage, but they never became as the centers of learning or even the centers of discipline like Kufa, Basra, and later on Baghdad, and then going all the way to Central Asia. Most of these only except in the time of the Sahaba, the companion, and maybe at the most the second generation, the Tabi'un. After the Tabi'un, that area is almost kind of deserted.
Yeah, but what about Shah Waliullah in like 17th, 16th, 17th century? Hijaz had a lot of intellectual.
No, he visits, and these big
He
scholars are
visits
going.
to study with the big scholars.
Yeah, they go there and teach in Makkah.
But they live there for years.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They will go, but there is no center as students coming, kind of, in other words, or learned, in other words, you could say, society or anything like that.
So there's no center. So I remember I said that those initial groups that came, they were not centralized. I said they were just individuals. They came and they were just individuals. There were no centralized organizations at this time period. The most important thing at this time period was this kind of the charisma that these individual sheikhs had, and then this link that they had between the disciple, so this kind of strong disciple, and then master-disciple link that they had. So they came from the Hijaz, and then there was, during this time period, there was like a semblance of Sufism in that region as well. And then your second question concerning the revolt of the Zanj, so that's in the 9th century of the Common Era. And so this is the region that's referred to. This part of Africa right here. This region right here is referenced as Balad Zanj or Zanuj. This region here, the 9th century of the Common Era. So what you have slave raiding into these regions here, right? And so most of the slaves that were taken, they ended up in Egypt. They didn't really end up, only a few of them ended up in the Arabian Peninsula, actually.
First, I would like to thank you very much for excellent presentation. I'm glad that I came. I did learn a lot.
Thank you.
I have got a few questions, but I'll play it by ears, one at a time, so to give other people a chance to ask questions. First question, when the Arab came to this country, they spoke Arabic, and all these people have got different language. How did they communicate? This is one question. And also, how they presented Islam to these people in Africa? What was the attraction they offered to them? Did the people become Muslim voluntarily or under the fear of losing economical advantages or whatever it is? Later I have more questions.
Okay. I guess I'll answer the first one. I'll answer the last one first. Okay, so you asked me concerning did they enter into Islam voluntarily or were they forced due to economic factors as well?
First, how did they communicate? Which language?
So they communicated as time began to progress. Then, so even despite the fact that the Baqt agreement was in 652 of the Common Era, there still was.
Can you speak louder?
Okay, I'm going to take this with me.
Please.
Okay, so remember when I talked about the Baqt agreement, and then this is a peace agreement that was signed between the Muslim Arabs and then the Christian Nubians in around 652 of the Common Era. So despite the fact that Baqt agreement, and I mentioned how that agreement, that peace treaty, laid the foundation for trade, and then Islam penetrating into Africa, south of the Saharan Desert, specifically in this region. So despite that fact, there still was trade between those regions prior to that time period. And so, even in the dynastic period in Egypt, there's always been communication and trade between Egypt and Nubia. So they know each other's languages. So they're not going to be completely fluent, for example, but then they'll know enough to engage in some sort of trade, commercial activity with one another. And so as time began to progress, around 14th, 15th, 16th century, the Common Era, as people started to embrace Islam, Arabic became a language that was essentially considered a holy language, became a lingua franca for trade, and then also became a language attached to nobility and noble class as well. So those identities in the Sudan, Arab identities in the Sudan are somewhat fluid. So those people in the northern part of Sudan began to embrace Islam. They also began to embrace Arab identity, and with Arab identity, embrace Arab language as well. So you have Arabization, Arabicization, Islamization. So first you have Islamization, Arabization, which is embracing of Arab cultural identity, and then you have Arabicization, which is the embracing or the adoption of Arabic language as well. So to answer your question, even prior to 652 of the Common Era, these people were able to communicate with each other. They knew each other's languages, not fluently, but then they could communicate with one another. Okay, and then just the last. Sorry?
The second question.
The second question.
What was the attractions about Islam to bring it to these people? Especially people like the Nubian. They have been Christian for a long time, and I would imagine they would have been satisfied with their religion. So, what was the convincing point?
Okay, so that's a good question. The problem with the Christian church in Nubia was that it never really penetrated into all the various levels of society. It just was a religion at the core, essentially, the religion of the political elites. So the people, the masses themselves, essentially, what they had to maintain a grasp upon their own indigenous religions. So, for example, in these regions, these people speak a Cushitic language. So all those individuals in this region here, Somalia, these regions, these are Cushitic-speaking individuals. They believe in one high God called the Waq. And so, as time began to progress, this Waq began to be replaced by Allah, and then trade figured very prominently as well. So, and attachment to Islam. Attachment to Islam and trade. What's attractive about Islam? Islam is very attractive to these societies that don't have this kind of culture or literacy. That's one. And then Islam also has this kind of aura of supernatural about So that's two, right? And then it also provides the people who embrace Islam an attachment, an adherence to this global religion. You form links with the outside world.
Also the tribe is very important. The tribal aspect, because that is, number one, the tribal, number two, marrying more than one woman, and third was basically the trade. So all these three factors.
Yes, please.
I'm fascinated by this broad brush stroke treatment, and as somebody who's spent more time in West Africa than your part of the world, I am interested in some of the distinctions rather than likenesses, I guess. I would begin, as you've mentioned, Sufism. I felt a certain assumption that Sufism, Tasawwuf equals the Turuk equals veneration of saints, a continuum which is very popularly held and widely demonstrated. But in the areas that I've worked in southern Mauritania, in fact, the study of Tasawwuf complemented fiqh, because in a stateless society, in a society that had no rule of law other than the rule of the local sheikh and his understanding of it, his authority came from Allah through a mechanism that was outside the state, that didn't depend upon that system. And I believe that has had a very prominent, I'm talking about 18th century, feeding into the 19th century, very profound effect in the emergence of Islam in much of the western Sudan, because many of those religious centers that inspired scholars and Islam in places like today's Nigeria, Mali, Senegal, originated further north in the southern Sahara. Now, what's fascinating is as especially the colonial powers start nipping around the edges and knowing the dangers of the Sufi orders to their experience elsewhere in the Islamic world, they bring a certain awareness to the potential for Tasawwuf to feed into Turuk, the Turuk to feed into communal organization, etc. And I nearly got once tarred and feathered in northern Nigeria at the university, saying that the French administration may have been one of the strongest Islamizing influences in West Africa. But the fact is that the particular preoccupation that the administration, or the French in particular, but the British also, brought to that area of West Africa spurred the idea, what I call the commodification of Tasawwuf, spurred the tariqas, the brotherhoods, in a fashion that had never been there right into the 19th century. A recent study of, I think the number was 150 of the texts that appear most frequently across about 120 libraries in the Sahara Desert and the Senegal Valley and into Mali, reveals a core curriculum that was studied and had been studied for several hundred years, and a core curriculum in which Tasawwuf played a very, very minor role. So I just, it may be this case in the Sudan that I'm not familiar with, but I would argue for the Western Sudan, a more sophisticated appreciation of where and how Tasawwuf plays the role that it plays in a historical distinction between the late 19th and 20th century and earlier periods.
Right, so there's a distinction between, there's a dichotomy that exists between Islamic mysticism, its role as far as the spread of Islam, its role as far as the spread of Islam, and then after around the 18th century, then you see the crystallization, consolidation of these Sufi orders. So that's when you see, for example, they become inextricably linked with Tasawwuf at that time first. So even in the Sudan, it's like that. For example, you have a Mogani says that the Sharia is the root, right? And then mysticism, Tasawwuf, is the tree. So they're linked to one another. Then it's like, those initial holy men did not say this. So remember I talked about, for example, how initially you have these local, you have these indigenous Sufis that were responsive to indigenous holy men, and then since they were not as well educated as their counterparts in Egypt and other parts of the region, their charisma was unfettered, and so this is what occurred. So you have this kind of unfettered charisma, and then they were not hesitant to maintain that they were these people that were repositories of esoteric knowledge, they performed miracles and such. So after around the 19th century or so, we didn't really see that. But then in the Sudan, Sufism, and Islamic Brotherhood's manifestation, or Sufism, I'm sorry, Islamic mysticism and its Sufi Brotherhood's manifestation is the most dynamic form of Islam. It's how Islam penetrated into the region. People continue to exert a great deal of influence on the religious culture of Sudan as well. And then the government was even really afraid. So during the early years of this government, this present regime, Bashir's government, they even tried to outlaw many of these Sufi orders as well. But then they couldn't, because it's such an integral part of the religious consciousness of the Sudanese. So it's similar in West Africa. As far as the initial spread, that's what I was talking about. So as far as this initial spread, okay, but then as time begins to progress, 18th and 19th century, you see some sort of divergences. So that's perhaps what you're seeing as well in Western Sudan, as opposed to the Eastern or East Sudan, southern part of Mauritania and such. Does that answer your question? That was your question, right? Yes? Okay.
This will be the last question now.
Okay, yes, please.
Yeah, you mentioned, I mean, for instance, if you could explain just a little bit, you had described how in the Sudan and the region there that Islamization kind of went hand in hand with Arabization. And today, of course, a lot of the Sudanese would consider themselves Arabs. What factors prevented an Arabization or a Berberization in West Africa? Because, I mean, it's quite evident that West African Islam is very indigenous, it springs from those areas, although there was an interplay with merchants and occasional military campaigns from the north. But what blocked that Arabization or Berberization?
So Arabization is like an immediate factor because it wasn't really Arabs that spread Islam into Africa, South of Sahara, and West and Central Africa. It was Berbers. So what blocked it? So in the Sudan, in the northern part of Sudan, we always had this kind of, there was always this trade between these two groups, and I talked about the intermarriage between the two Nubian noblewomen and the Arab men, the traders. You don't really have that much this intermarriage here in this part, these regions as well, so that's one factor. You also have very strong states in this region. So you have states such as Ghana, medieval empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai as well. In this region here, you have these states are beginning to collapse. So these people in this region have a strong cultural identity. These people in this region here, their identity is beginning to decline as Nubians. So they're going to try to latch onto anything. It's going to give themselves a semblance of some sort of past glory or such. And so Islam, Arab culture, perhaps afforded them that as well. So those are the theories that some of these scholars may mention as well. Okay, yes, please. I think, yes.
There have been a lot of missionary Christian activities in Africa. do you think as a result of the Christian missionary activity in Africa, many people have been converted from Islam to Christianity as a result of that? And overall, do you think Islam is rising or declining? Christianity is rising or declining in Africa? Are they competing with each other? And what is the latest scores?
What was the last thing that you said, please?
And what's the score? Who's
score?
ahead of each other?
Score of.
Who is winning? Who is making more converts?
Both are winning.
I don't have any
It's kind of
figures.
beyond the
Any
scope of the
statistics,
lecture.
yeah.
I don't have the demographics of who is.
I don't need
I don't know.
statistics.
Actually. I don't know the
But
statistics.
overall, what's your impression? Do you think the missionary Christian activity have succeeded to win many people converted to Christianity, or the Islamic missionary activities is winning more? Who's ahead?
Islam spread more in West Africa.
No, I'm
Europe-
talking
No,
about
no,
recent.
the answer
recent,
to, the answer to this is that it is not about Christians converting Muslims or Muslims converting Christians in Africa, but it's primarily each religion is competing to convert people from indigenous religions.
Right. So it's
You
against the
know,
law.
that's where each religion is growing in various ways. So in the Christian sphere, I think the debate is about, you know, are Pentecostal, charismatic type churches, you know, have kind of an affinity to African style, or is the Catholic Church able to adapt its form of worship to ways that resonate with indigenous? So there's kind of a Catholic Protestant thing going on. And I suppose on the Islam side, it would be Saudi Wahhabi institutions and school and education versus Tasawwuf, and also the Ahmadi factor, because the Ahmadis were among the first ones on the ground in Africa. So it's like varieties of Islam, varieties of Christianity. How do they interface with local culture? And you know, it's a different call.
If I would like to summarize my question, who is more effective than the other nowadays or within the last century?
I'll give you. There's no answer actually. I'll give you an example. So for example, in Darfur, you know, everyone's familiar with the problems in Darfur. So there's a lot of Christian groups there that are involved in. They have some NGOs there that are involved.
Can you use the mic?
Sorry. So there are a lot of NGOs that are in Darfur. So there's some Christian groups, but then. Sorry.
Some organizations from coming from
Outside,
America
yes.
or
Right. They're not Sudanese. So in Darfur, you have some Christian organizations. They're involved in like helping people, these orphans and such. But they're not effective as far as proselytizing. They're not effective as far as converting individuals. 99% of the population in Darfur identifies themselves as Muslims. The only people that they will be effective as far as converting are people, some small children that are orphans and such. They adopt them or put them in these orphanages and such, or bring them to the United States or these other places. So they're not really effective as far as proselytizing or converting individuals. That's the only place I could really talk about any kind of authority. I can't tell you who's winning. I don't know if there's even a...
And not try to project it winner or loser, and just like to get a picture. Who's in the right, who's in the forward, and just get...
So I always hear that Islam is the fastest growing religion in continent Africa. So I always hear that. So
Every religion almost says the same
I think it
nowadays.
depends where.
and I also know that 1 out of every 3 person on the continent of Africa is a Muslim. So 1/3 of the population is a Muslim, according to like the recent statistics.
1/3?
That's what I heard recently, recently.
Closer to 1/2.
So there. So for example, in Ethiopia, if you listen to the government will say, well, the majority of the population in Ethiopia is Christian. However, in Ethiopia, they had a census. I mean, the government doesn't like to reveal this, but then, as you mentioned, in Ethiopia, the actual numbers of Muslims are 1/2 of the population. Because the government in Ethiopia wants to maintain this kind of this aura that it is one of the oldest, it's the oldest Christian country in Africa, so they want to maintain this kind of aura that they're like one of the last vestiges of Christianity in Africa as well. So you can never really tell as far as the statistics are concerned. So I don't know who's winning the war or the the game.
Thank you very much.
It's a war or game.
Okay.
We can continue the conversation after. I'd like to invite Dr. Marcia Hermanson up.
On behalf of American Islamic College, I'd like to present you with this token of our appreciation, which is an Ebru Turkish design.
Thank you very much. It's too kind.
Thank you very much. It was very insightful. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Are you at Loyola?
There is a talk next Tuesday, February 21st on Islamic biomedical ethics, Islamic views of organ transplantation. So it's going to be very interesting.